When many of us are small children, we have a particular object that we need for emotional stability and security, like a security blanket, just like Linus, Lucy's younger brother, in the Peanuts cartoon. However, if we lose this object, we feel that we can't make it through the day, and we don't know how we're going to feel better about ourselves. This issue is particularly important when considering this week's Parasha. This week we'll read about the Egel HaZahab, the golden calf, one of the most infamous incidents in Tanakh in the entire history of the Jewish people. Many biblical commentators and philosophers have been puzzled by this event. How did the generation that experienced the Exodus and heard the created speech of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai allow themselves to be fooled and fall into such a deep spiritual pit? To answer this question, we have to look at two important phrases from the first four psukim of the 32nd chapter of Sefer Shemot. Vayikal ha'am al Aharon v'amru elav, Kum aseh lanu Elohim asher yalchu lefanenu, ki ze Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elenu me'eretz Mitzrayim, lo yada'anu mehayalo. Vayomru ele Elohecha Yisrael, asher ha'alucha me'eretz Mitzrayim. When we read Targum Onkelos, we see that the word Elohim is not translated as the Shem HaMeforash, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, or the typical Aramaic cognate, Elah, but as the word Dachlan. This word is particularly interesting, since in the Targum, it's used in two particular contexts, fear and idolatry. These two themes are essential to understanding this parasha. At the beginning of this episode, Rabbeinu Abraham ibn Ezra explains that the people had begun speculating that Moshe Rabbeinu had died and was never going to come back. And they were afraid that they would have no connection to God otherwise. So they started to scramble to create a physical and tangible representation of God's providence. And this is why they confronted Aharon, the first Kohen HaGadol, before he was anointed, to ask him to make this statue. It seems that the word Dachlan in this context is connected both to fear and idolatry. It's a sort of fear-abating idol, a security blanket of sorts. While many of us in the modern age can't grasp why they chose to make the statue in the form of a calf, it was actually very appropriate for the context. According to commentators like Rabbeinu Avraham ben Harambam and Rabbeinu Yitzhak Ramah, the form of a cow or bull symbolized the power of heaven in Egyptian culture that Bnei Israel had lived in for over 200 years, or 400 years, depending on how you count it. And from their perspective, this would have been a great honor to depict God in this manner. While we understand why the masses would feel this way, it's quite surprising that Aharon, the future Kohen HaGadol, and someone who had proverbially seen God alongside Moshe, Yehoshua, and the elders of Israel, he would have even chosen to do such a thing. How could he? It's important to note that the golden calf is tied to the chronology of the foundation of the Mishkan and its kelim, like the Aron HaKodesh. Some scholars believe these commandments came before the Egel HaZahav, and some believe they came afterwards. But no matter what your stance on this, there's almost certainly a connection. Professor Rabbi Moshe David Kasuto said that Aharon felt the need to balance the needs of the people with the truth of God's transcendent nature that he had learned alongside his brother. While he accepted the petition to make a Dachlan, he thought that the statue could act as a metaphorical footstool for God and not a literal totem of sorts for the divine presence. This would be the function later carried out by the cheruvim, the angels on top of the kaporet, the covering of the Aron HaKodesh. As Kasuto later describes, the major important difference between the cheruvim and the golden calf was that the former was obviously a fictitious creature, and people would not have confused it as a literal representation of God manifest in nature and would have seen it as a symbolic ornament. However, with his noble intentions, Aharon failed. He didn't follow Moshe's stern example to make a clean break from all physical representations of the divine, especially as contained in the first 10 commandments themselves. He had unwittingly reinforced the negative spiritual culture in which the Jewish people had languished for hundreds of years. This painful episode was the beginning of the Jewish people's spiritual growth into adolescence from childhood of sorts. The innocent and childlike faith of much of Am Yisrael had been based on witnessing the plagues in Egypt and God's miracles in the desert, but they had made the mistake of assuming that Moshe's physical presence was a necessary condition for a connection with God. Unfortunately, they turned the greatest prophet of all time into a security blanket of sorts, and then later nearly turned into idolatry because they needed to replace the feeling of stability that they felt only when Moshe was among them. In conclusion, it was quite important that Moshe Rabbeinu destroyed the first tablets of the Ten Commandments after witnessing what the people had done. This act was the ultimate anathema to his worldview and the worldview that God wanted to inculcate among the Jewish people. Moshe wanted to make it very clear that neither he or any object in the physical world could help them create a meaningful connection with God. As Ramban notes in the first part of the guide, the only way to know God is to negate aspects of things we find in the world. This is precisely the process that Moshe used to reach his level of wisdom. And the ultimate reward that he receives is detailed in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. ומשה רבנו לא חזר לאוהלו הראשון, לפיכך פירש מן האישה לעולם ומכל הדומה לה, ונקשרה דעתו מצור העולמים. Throughout his life, Moshe had reached this level of prophecy and connection to God by negating the attributes of the physical universe and cutting away from sentimental attachment to physical things. By the time of Ma'amad Har Sinai, he had reached a level of pure intellectual and prophetic connection to God that no other person could ever reach. He knew that only by losing our metaphorical security blankets, every Jew, both then and now, could become secure in our knowledge and loyalty to the true and one and only God, the real one who freed us from Egypt. Shabbat Shalom.